Good morning and welcome to the Beyond Words session this morning. I'm Sheila Hollins. I'm the founder and chair of Books Beyond Words. I'm also a psychiatrist, now retired, and a member of the House of Lords. Books Beyond Words began when my son was a child and was unable to communicate in words, and I started using wordless stories, which my husband, who's quite a good artist, would draw to try to explain to him things that were going to happen. And we found that they really helped him to manage even quite complicated things like the death of his grandfather. When I started working with children and adults with learning disabilities, I started using the same approach with them and began by creating a book called When Dad Died. For 30 years now, we've been creating stories, many of them with a mental health or social emotional mental health themes to help both children and adults. And 2 years ago, we began a project called Open Book, which we're going to tell you about today. The focus of today's session is quite simply social emotional mental health within primary schools. And I'm joined by a very able panel of speakers. We're going to begin by hearing from Professor Barry Carpenter, but just do remember to put any questions you have for our panel of speakers in the swap card so that we can respond to as many as we can when the presentation finishes. So we're going to begin with Barry Carpenter, who's a Professor of Mental Health at Oxford Brookes University, and in a pre-recorded presentation.
The Open Book Project was conceived for reasons of safeguarding around our children, but within that broader context of the exponential rise in the mental health needs of children across all ranges of age and ability. And that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. In fact, the findings, as you will hear from the Open Book Project, have an increased relevance because of what we're experiencing now in this moment. There have been some new initiatives in education that further bolster the work of the Open Book Project. The Mental Health First Aid Programme, the mental health leads in every type of school. Well, what resources are there for us as teachers? Because mental health has never been our background. In fact, mental health is a diagnosis, and for us our term is probably more around emotional well-being as a curriculum response. And so there was a very straightforward question that motivated the Open Book Project, was in what way could the Books Beyond Words and that rich library of resources that Baroness Hollins and colleagues have created over many years now, how could they resource social, emotional and mental health within the curriculum? We've created Lenny and Lily in Lockdown books, which have proved very popular for children of all abilities across the primary range. Overall, from this project, what we really found was the high levels of participation and motivation. And not just that alone, but that our children and young people of all abilities began to innovate, to articulate their emotions. As one senior leadership team said, these books are a wonderful guide. They're a visual crib sheet that we can use to support our pupils and increase their confidence, open up opportunities to develop their emotional wealth. Quite simply, how do we build that emotional wealth? How do we make our children and young people emotionally strong, emotionally resilient to face the rapidly changing demands of the world around them? The Open Book Project taught us that through Books Beyond Words, routes to well-being are opened. Emotional well-being can be restored, and mental well-being in particular can help any child and young person deal with trauma, anxiety, loss and grief. And those issues are more important now than ever.
We're in an area of high deprivation with around 61% of pupils on pupil premium. The school had been in special measures and was awaiting its first inspection. The school had its challenges at that time, as it still does in many ways. One of the things that came to light very quickly, though, was that we had a significant number of children with social emotional needs. We had 8 children who had suffered a recent bereavement of a close family member. And whilst the pupil premium brings in good revenue for the school, what was very clear was that services for mental health were stretched to capacity. There was a long waiting list for referring children, or there was simply nowhere for them to turn at that time. Improving pupil progress and attainment, as with every school, was obviously very, very important. But it seemed to be screaming out here that we needed to meet the social emotional needs of these children and meet them quickly. I believed that rather than reaching out to professionals beyond the school who didn't have the relationships with children, that it was important that we use the strength of our own team. And obviously Marie Grant was a vital part in that, and her experience with Beyond Words became a very important starting point to meeting the wellbeing needs of our children. At the time, Marie was one of our Year 6 teachers, so it felt like a risk releasing her from class to use the books Beyond Words with groups of children, yet at the same time it seemed to be fundamentally the right thing to do to meet the needs of these children. And we tracked it very, very carefully, looking at their attainment, their attendance, their attitudes to learning, and what we found was all of these things improved rapidly. SATS results were above national for that year, and it absolutely paid off. It was worth the risk 100% and continues to benefit the children throughout school. Following the initial success with some of the Year 6 children and Marie's initial groups that she used the books Beyond Words with, we felt it was important that we made it sustainable, that we rolled this approach out throughout school. So Marie's next step was to do some training with all of the teaching assistants and to train them on the principles of Books Beyond Words and how they could be used as a vehicle for supporting the needs of our children. We also had to work with all of the teaching staff in order that mental health and well-being was a whole school priority, that everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet, and that our parents and our entire community knew that this was a very important aspect to life at Leydes Primary School. Acknowledging feelings, talking about feelings, being honest and open about mental health had to be something that all of us as staff members were willing to model for the children, and to make it absolutely part of the normal day that we talk about our feelings and we don't feel it's something to be ashamed of. Marie continues to support individual children and groups using the books Beyond Words on a weekly basis, but following the pandemic, the use of Books Beyond Words with regards to children's experience of lockdown and their potential fears or worries about returning to school was rolled out in every class throughout school from nursery through to Year 6 in order to ensure that all staff were confident with using the materials and that every child in the school had the opportunity to talk about their experience and to talk about their worries and their future concerns, in order that we dealt with that and that children were settled and ready to come back to learning following the time away from school. It's been hugely successful, and it has modelled an approach that the children then feel that they are comfortable talking to staff and that they know they have a range of people that they can share any concerns with and that things will be dealt with quickly.
My introduction to Beyond Words books came from having 3 bereavements of parents within a very short space of time in the school that I had just started at. And I was asked if I knew anything that we could do to help with the children, as they were not able to talk about it. And I met Baroness Sheila Hollins, and she introduced me to one of the books, When Someone Dies, or When Dad Dies, I think. And I thought, oh, that would be good. And I took it back to school and I said to the senior leadership team, I think this might help. And we started a little group just for children from bereavement. So we called it a feelings group rather than a bereavement group. And they got together and we used the book to talk through And we realised the lack of knowledge they had on the words around bereavement, such as what a coffin was, what a church was, what a cremation was, because we realised they didn't go, so they'd had no closure in that sense, they'd never been, and they had no concept of what actually happened after somebody died. So that was the first part, that an introduction, realised how powerful they've been as a starting point for using those words and developing their vocabulary around funerals and bereavement. We also at the time had quite a lot of children, and we still have, who had been victims of abuse of various kinds, whose behaviour was beginning to be rather disruptive in class and around school. And the senior leadership team want to know if this feelings group and using Beyond Words books would be useful with them. So this is more of a difficult topic. So we brought more of the books in, Finding a Safe Place from Abuse, When Dad Hurts Mum, and I Can Get Through It. And I used to start off with individual pictures from the books, not the whole book, just to get to know where the children were at. And particularly one picture was from Finding a Safe Place from Abuse, and there was a bruise on the arm. But the children who had not been abused didn't recognise the bruise on the arm, but the children who did spotted it and allowed them to talk about, gave a place for talking about what they thought had possibly caused that. And of course, they talk from their own experience at this point. So from this grew out feelings groups. So we then did them from different ages throughout the school. So we had upper key stage 2 groups and lower key stage 2 groups. And we'd do the time as book clubs, but in more on a self-help to help each other, using the pictures as a way of talking about what had happened to them in a confidential and safe setting. We did this for the year with no idea of what the outcome was going to be, but it was about helping the children's well-being and giving the children who had been abused and were now in foster care a chance to talk in a safe environment. Because these conversations are very difficult to have. The children know that you know, but how do you go and say, how are you feeling today about this, being in foster care? You don't. So the pictures allowed it to be in a safe, confidential way where they could talk about the characters without actually talking about themselves to start off with. And then it leads on to them saying that they've experienced something like this. And they're now very attuned into looking at the body language, how the fists are clenched, what their eyes are doing, whether they're looking at people, whether they're not facing people, the aura of colour around the characters. Because in the books, the artist has really carefully used appropriate colours to signify the feelings that are taking place. And the children are very attuned into picking up on those and giving their ideas why that person might not be feeling so happy. So we moved on from that to doing one-to-ones with more sensitive issues. And we used the Beyond Words books to start the conversation in a safe place and know where the children are, to then create their own books from this, using the pictures from Beyond Words books to tell their own story in a safe place. We just did it with Key Stage 2 children, first of all, because we weren't quite sure how it was going to be. And then we've introduced it to Key Stage 1 with some of the safer books, for example, like Ginger is a Hero. And that has allowed a conversation around what happens when somebody is ill, their knowledge of how to use the emergency services, which is hilarious. 911 comes up a lot. They obviously watch a lot of American television. They have no idea about 999. So we've had to clarify that point, and about the ambulance and the police arriving. And sometimes it's only 2 or 3 pages, but it starts a whole half an hour's conversation with Key Stage 1 children about what is actually happening and their misconceptions. On a separate PSHE issue, we realised that the older children moving on to secondary school needed some way to talk about puberty and the changes taking place. And so for so long now, it's just been done, in class in front of everyone. Well, we don't know what the children are thinking or what knowledge do they have already. So we're doing it around Susan's Growing Up and George Gets Smart, the 2 different books. George Gets Smart for the boys because then it's about their own hygiene and the change that take place with them. And Susan is Growing Up because, in actual fact, that book was so accurate when I used it because that had happened with a child in my class. But because she was in foster care, she was too scared to come and tell me that this had happened. But using the book allowed me to say, it's okay. and she was able to take it to a foster carer at home and show about what happened. So that gives an insight that perhaps more children needed this, and it was a safe place to talk about that.
This was one of the first books when I came to Feelings School we ever did. We literally get the same books, but not as this. We get it as paper, and we write down what we what might be going on in that, and we curate our own stories. I think this really, really helps us because there's other people in this group that have a lot problems similar to these, and I like Feelings Group. It's really cool.
We have these books, and Miss Grant gave us one at end to take home.
Yeah, she gave us these to still share our feelings and see how other people feel as well.
I've been a part of the Books Beyond Words project from the first phase. We've covered several of the books over that time, but I certainly find now that this is my go-to resource. There just isn't another resource available on the market that is age appropriate and covers the sensitive issues and social issues that you find that you need that extra prompt for. This opens discussions immediately. Sometimes before you even open the book, the illustration on the front can inspire somebody to think about something that's happened in their own lives. I've certainly found that visual literacy has improved with all of the students. They are now reading people's body language through looking at the characters and through asking the open questions of, I wonder how they are feeling, I wonder what they are doing. We've gone from using happy and sad to describe every emotion to expanding that out to excited, depressed, anxious, worried. The vocabulary has increased massively, and that certainly for special educational students increases their independence no end. It gives them the tools to be able to explain how they are feeling and interpret how others might be feeling in situations. So we've tried using the book club model, which we found was really successful with our students, because not only are they actually a part of a group, they are learning to take turns, they're listening to each other, they're helping each other, they're discussing the issues in the book together. So we've had small groups of students all with their own book and also using the online facility as well to look at specific pages. And we found that certain books like Making Friends have really made a huge difference with how they interact with each other. Understanding appropriate and inappropriate interactions is something that's taken quite a long while to be able to gain that level of comprehension. The books dealing with bereavement, we've found that that's an excellent resource. Again, there's not a huge amount of information that's appropriate for our cognitive level of learners. And the bereavement books really they're very to the point. It is as it is, and that actually the facts need to be put out there to have those open discussions. And we found one of our young men lost a grandparent and was really struggling with the whole concept because it was through the whole COVID pandemic as well. So he hadn't been able to go to the funeral, he hadn't been able to go to some of those traditional things that we do to be able to deal with the loss of someone close to us. He hadn't been able to experience any of those. And literally through looking at the book, we thought it would take us to at least halfway through the book for him to acknowledge his own experience. But he looked at the front cover and straight away said, Grandma, he signed it, which was incredible for us. There's a huge array of titles in the Books Beyond Words series, and I find now that it's my resource of choice, and it's a really easy resource to pick up and use. You don't necessarily have to do the whole book from start to finish. It can sometimes be as effective to just pick out a particular page, but the illustrations and the subjects that are covered, it just gives you such an easy access points to start discussions, to start those difficult conversations sometimes, and be able to support students in their own comprehension of these difficult topics. They are really, really easy to access, and definitely I would recommend them to everybody to give them a go.
Well, thank you to our speakers. Our panel today includes Professor Barry Carpenter, who's Professor of Mental Health in Education at Oxford Brookes University and Open Books Project Director, Georgina Fletcher, Head Teacher of Lathes Primary School in South Yorkshire, Marie Grant, who is the Mental Health and Safeguarding Lead at Lathes and Beyond Words Open Book Mentor, and Nick Wright, who is the Chief Executive of Beyond Words. I'm going to ask each of the panelists an opening question, whilst I'm waiting to see some of the questions that you might have put to the panel. Please don't be slow to come forward with your questions. First of all, I want to ask Georgina. Georgina, you're a head teacher of a primary school, and you made an extraordinary statement. You said that children's attainment, attitudes, and attendance all improved significantly during the year that they started using the stories, wordless stories, with Marie's guidance. Could you just say a little bit more about that? Were you surprised?
Yes, well, obviously, attainment and progress, these are the things that we talk about all the time. We think about Ofsted criteria, but fundamentally when there are children who are really struggling with their emotions, with their feelings, or trauma that's taken place at home, you can just put sticking plasters on, you can do another reading intervention, another maths intervention, but if you don't actually address those underlying issues, then the progress doesn't come. So what we found that by using Marie to work directly with the children, to give them an open and a safe space to talk about the things that were troubling them, that then when they went back to the classroom, they were in a really good mindset to be able to learn. It was very powerful, very quickly.
Marvellous, thank you very much. And Marie, you started feelings groups, which sounds a very lovely, gentle approach. Can you say a bit more about how the children actually changed during the time that they were in the feelings group?
When they first came, because it was an unknown setting for them, they were very reluctant to talk, and they wouldn't share with each other because they thought they were the only one there with the same problem. But putting the pictures up on the board, so that the focus wasn't on them to talk about themselves, it took away that fear and anxiety, and they were quite happy to talk about the pictures that I would mirror up on the board because they were used to doing that in class. And as it went along, they became more confident to speak, and they realised what was happening, and they realised that we're never going to be asked direct questions, because the question was always, I wonder what was happening. That they themselves began to volunteer to talk about what had happened to them. They'd say, that's like me, that's my story, that's what happened to me. And then I would say, would you like to tell the rest of the group about it? And they would do, because they felt it was somewhere safe and it wasn't direct threatening. Like sometimes, like an interrogation, it can feel sometimes like, tell me about what happened at home last night. It wasn't like that. It was much more gentle. So there was a more willingness for them to start the conversations then. And at the end, they would initiate the conversation and I didn't need to, and I said less and less. And they ran the group themselves. So that's how it changed.
Right. And of course, Barry, you were over the book project, and one of the issues really was to do with teachers' confidence in being able to begin those conversations, and possibly perhaps feeling worried about what might actually happen if the children said something that they didn't know how to work with. Could you say a little bit more about that? I think they started by setting their own best hopeful outcomes, but then teacher confidence increased, didn't it?
Teacher confidence increased greatly. This was a new medium, simple as it may seem, a wordless book, which is basically made up of pictures, ought to be a very familiar medium, but of course so many teachers, particularly our primary colleagues, are very focused on literacy attainment, and to use a book that doesn't have words in it and children are not decoding graphically or phonetically the words is quite challenging. And we have to get the message through. This is about emotional literacy. And so eventually teachers' best hope for outcomes, which was really a nice phrasing. You know, we can't always be sure what the end point is going to be, can we? But we know what our direction of travel is going to be and what we might hope the children can, to use Georgina's words, attain and achieve. And so that whole approach was really very useful. And as teachers became more confident using things like the online learning materials that were developed alongside the Open Book project, they began to realize the depth of emotion for which there was, as Lee said in some of her contribution to the presentations today, there were no other resources available that would enable us as teachers in the primary sector to frame and help the children articulate emotions for which they often did not have the language. It gave them a vehicle for that.
So one of the questions that's come in is about why there aren't more resources like this. And I suppose, I mean, in a way, I think you've all answered it by talking about, you know, how nervous we all are really about broaching sensitive subjects for fear that we may not have the skills to be able to respond appropriately. I mean, you spoke about emotional literacy, and of course what this also does is to continue to develop children's visual literacy, which is very important in their very early years, but perhaps is not taken quite so seriously at the primary stage. But the language still did develop, so it wasn't the reading the words, but it was speaking the words that were relevant. And I think all of the speakers found that, didn't they, that children's emotional vocabulary became much richer. Marie, could you just say something more about the use of emotional language? I mean, I know you've already spoken about it, but it just seems so important.
Yeah, the general words that we used within the primary setting that we, Georgina and myself were in, would tend to be, the feelings they had would be mad or sad. And that's what describe. And they were very limited to that. So we actually put a variety of feeling words up on the wall in each classroom. And when we told them pain-filled feelings and joy-filled feelings to get them to weigh. So was it hurting inside or was it making you feel happy? And then when they were talking about something that actually wasn't really sad, I'd say perhaps that you were actually angry, and then use the word angry for that, or perhaps you're feeling miserable. So we'd introduce those words, and then the children began to apply them to what they were actually feeling inside, rather than just saying mad and sad or furious.
Oh, that's lovely. And there's some very specific questions. Do we have a script? And the point, no, we don't have a script. We always try to use, there's a script in that there are some suggested I wonder questions, but the idea is not to in any way impose your own thoughts or feelings on the reader. What's the best time to take the children out of the classroom for this kind of work, Marie or Georgina?
We use the whole day. So some of the feelings groups are done in the morning, some one-to-ones are done in the morning, and it's 1 day a week, and the whole day is set out to the feelings group, so children leave at different times during the day, regardless of what subject they're doing. It's seen as an intervention, and it's as important as a maths intervention or an English intervention.
Okay. And with respect to, and some schools have actually started using some of the materials in the school assembly, haven't they? Which seems like a superb idea. Just given we're in the middle of a pandemic, is now a good time to start introducing these resources, Barry?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you think of the additional resources, Sheila, that have been developed by Books Beyond Words during this pandemic, the books about beating the virus, and the one about having a test. I, before a lockdown, in a socially distanced way, visited our local primary school and walked in on the Year 3 teacher who on his whiteboard had the new pamphlet booklet that we've been producing at Books Beyond Words about being tested. And that is so, so important. I mean, the size of those swabs they want to put up children's noses and down their throats can be quite terrifying if you're only a wee child. And it's just fantastic to see the dynamic response. So I would encourage any teacher, there's a new opportunity presented by this pandemic for these resources to touch those children at their point of learning need.
Very good. And there's some very good questions which we don't have time to answer. There's one about how children might react when dealing with strong emotions. Can I just encourage people to come to our virtual booth? I'm going to invite Nick Wright to tell you how you could begin to use these resources and how you could hear more by making an appointment with our virtual booth. Over to you, Nick, Chief Executive.
Well, thank you to all our 4 presenters. That's been really, really stimulating. I hope you've all found it too. If you want to find out more, do come to our virtual booth. It's very easy to find on the Swapcard website, or just go to our website, booksbeyondwords.co.uk. We will be available, our mentors will be available. We have regionally based mentors to help with this open book programme, which we're rolling out nationally. And we'd love to talk to you, because I think if you get these books in children's hands, you will see the benefit. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, everybody. And I think we are probably at the end of our time now, and enjoy the rest of the conference.